It's good to be here. Thanks to the ALS Association Florida chapter for having me, and a special thanks to my colleague, Dr. Michael Benatar, for not wearing his palm tree sequined embroidered blazer today. I'm always embarrassed when the two of us show up wearing this thing at the same meeting. So I'm going to tell you about a project I've been working on now for the past 7 years. It's called ALS Untangled. A nickname for it is the X-Files of ALS. And hopefully, am I supposed to point this at something? Oh, there it goes. Hopefully you all know what the X-Files is. Just to make sure we're on the same page, this was a very popular TV show, as well as a few movies that ran about a decade ago now. It actually made a brief comeback this year. And the premise of the show was there was a guy named Fox Mulder. When he was a kid, he was supposed to be watching his baby sister, Samantha, and she disappeared, never to be seen again. And the story that he told is that she was kidnapped by aliens. And of course, nobody believed him. And so Fox spent the rest of his life trying to prove the existence of aliens and similarly bizarre phenomena. And so every week would start off with something strange happening, and then Fox and his team investigating to see if it really could be explained scientifically or not. So this was my own Samantha. This was a 60-ish-year-old university professor who came to my clinic, unfortunately, with a pretty classic case of ALS. After I finished talking to her about the disease and educating her about her stage-appropriate treatment options, I sat down and had a conversation about research and asked her if she wanted to be in one of my open studies. She told me that she'd be happy to come to the clinic and she'd be happy to take advantage of things like Riluzole and good nutrition and attention to her respiration and things like that. But she was going to pass on the research because she'd found something on the internet that she was going to try called hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Now again, this was a very highly educated woman. She didn't necessarily believe that hyperbaric oxygen was the fountain of youth, as some websites claim. But she was incredibly impressed by an anecdote on a website of a patient who reported that he had ALS, that he had progressed dramatically, and that he started using hyperbaric oxygen and now was much better, a so-called ALS reversal. Well, you can imagine the look on my face the first time I heard somebody say something like this was a little bit like that of Fox Mulder when he came face to face with real-life aliens for the first time as an adult. And as I drove home that day, I said to myself, I wonder if this is a common decision that people and families with ALS make to go on the internet and to seek alternative therapies. And it turns out that it is. So no matter if you survey patients or you survey family members, about 50% of patients with ALS will try at least one of these so-called alternative therapies during their illness. Why do they do this? Well, to all of you, the answer is obvious. We know that ALS is one of the world's worst diseases. We know that most people with ALS progress, become massively disabled, and have shortened lifespans. We like to think that we have things to offer you in our clinics, but the reality is those things only make a small difference as far as how well you do. And even the things that we have in our research studies right now, we hope might do a little better. We don't have the home run in any of our research studies right now. And so, like this old poster from the X-Files, people want to believe that there's something better out there. And so if you ask patients, why are you doing this? Why are you searching the internet for these treatments? Many of them think they're going to find something that will cure their ALS. More of them think they're going to find something that will at least slow them down. A very common answer that I hear from people is, I already have ALS. What worse could possibly happen to me if I try this? And so into that background comes the internet, which now makes it easier than ever for people who want to try an alternative therapy to find one. In fact, if you went home and you Googled ALS treatments, you'd find more than 40 million hits on the internet. Now, clearly not all of those are alternative treatments, but many of them are, including some of the first ones that usually come up. The other thing about the internet is that there are no internet police. So you can pretty much say anything that you want to about whatever it is that you're selling, and nobody can really hold you accountable. So it's very common, for example, for websites to say things like, quote unquote, clinically proven, and quote unquote, perfectly safe. So for example, if you look at this screenshot from an alternative therapy called Mototab, you can see what I mean. So Mototab was actually brought in by one of my patients one day in clinic, and they said, "Doc, how come you never told us about this? You say you're an ALS expert, but here I found this website that said this is the world's most relied upon treatment for motor neuron disease, and you didn't even know what it was." And you can see over in the right-hand side of the slide, it says that this is clinically proven, and on the bottom it says it's completely guaranteed. You're at no risk. So what's the problem? The problem is that the information that you have to back up these claims is often either absent or flawed or just completely wrong. In fact, a good rule of thumb about alternative therapies on the internet comes from another X-Files poster, and that is trust no one. So let me give you some examples of some of the things that are out there. So the first one I think is probably pretty easy for folks to see that there's a problem. This is an example of absent information. You might say, how could somebody try to sell me something and have no information at all to back up their claims? Well, this is how that works. So you see over there at the edge of the blue arrow, it says that you can download a study that proves that Mototab works. And so you click on that link, and this is what comes up. Clinical study will soon be posted here. And if you go back and you look at when this website was actually created, oops, it was created 12 years ago. So I don't know how big the file has to be to take 12 years to download, but that must be some kind of study. So another type of information that's much, much harder to decipher is what I call flawed information. So here's an example of that. So this is a graph that came off of a website for what was at one time the most popular, most profitable stem cell clinic in the world. It was called the X Cell Center, and it was in Germany. And the idea was that they would take out your own stem cells from your bone marrow, and they would modify them, and they would inject them back into some part of your body, blood, muscle, spinal fluid. So it's not a bad idea. There's a company that many of you have heard of before that's trying something like that. In fact, they're actually doing clinical trials. So if you went on this website and you looked under ALS results, you would find this graph. And what it shows is that there's a group of 33 people that they followed who had this treatment, and you can see that the great majority of them were either stable or improved after they had it. That's not the natural history of ALS, right? Does anybody have any questions or see any problems with that? Well, the graph doesn't actually say what they measured, does it? So we finally got a hold of someone, and we asked them, and what they did is they called patients on the telephone, usually somewhere between 1 and 6 months after they had the stem cells, and they said, "So, how you doing? Do you feel like you're better, about the same, or worse?" And that's basically what this graph is, what patients said as far as how they were doing. So have you ever heard of something called the placebo effect? So it's a very common thing that happens, especially when a person is faced with a terrible disease like ALS. Whatever the next thing they try is, they and their families, they really want it to work. They want it to work so bad that they can convince themselves that at least for a while they feel better. That's the placebo effect. It even happens to people taking placebos. And it's more likely to happen if the thing that you're taking is invasive. So these folks had to have a bone marrow biopsy, they had to have blood draws, maybe a spinal tap. That's pretty invasive. It's more likely to happen if whatever it was cost you a lot of money. In this case, this was $20,000. So most likely what these folks were looking at is nothing more than the placebo effect. And that's why we have to use placebos in our phase 3 clinical trials to avoid things like this. So here's another example, and this one is even harder to spot. This comes from something probably the most popular of all the treatments that ALS Untangled has reviewed in the past 7 years called the Deanna Protocol. This is a collection of supplements that were put together by an orthopedic surgeon to try to help his daughter who was diagnosed with ALS. And there's a paper that's published. It's mostly an animal study. But in the paper, there's a comment that says the success rate of the Deanna Protocol in patients with ALS is 85%. That seems kind of amazing. What does that mean? Well, if you look in the supplemental data, this is where they came up with 85%. So they had 40 graphs of patients with ALS who tracked their ALS functional rating scale over time. Just to make sure you know what that is, the ALS functional rating scale, it's a questionnaire. It's 12 questions, each pertaining to one part of your body, and it's scored from 0 to 4. So 4 is totally normal. For example, if I say, how are you speaking? And you say totally normal, you get a 4 for speech. 0 means you have no function at all. So a normal score is 48. A 0 means nothing's really working at all. I don't think, seen anyone with a 0 on that scale. So they had 40 people who tracked that over time. And what they say here is that on average, the ALS functional rating scale declines by about 1 point per month. And since 34 of their 40 patients were progressing slower than 1 point per month, that means 85% of them were doing better than they should have done on the Deanna Protocol. You see any problems with that? What do you see? You shake your head. What do you see? Okay, so it's an incomplete cure, but there is a bigger problem. So the bigger problem is this. As many of you probably know, the progression of ALS is wildly different between patients. Some people come to clinic and they hardly change from visit to visit. I see some of my patients only once a year and they hardly change. Other patients change so fast you can't believe it, right? So that's what those graphs are. That's a series of 30 patients' ALS FRS scores over time. So the first problem is the natural history is highly variable. Although on average, it does progress at 1 point per month. It's wildly different between patients. The second problem that we have is we don't know how many people actually took the Deanna Protocol. What if there were 4,000 people that were on the Deanna Protocol and we only had scores from 40? Which type of person do you think is most likely to submit scores? A patient who's doing well. You think a person who tries something for 6 months and does terrible is likely to say anything about it? They're probably just going to move on to the next thing. So this is an example of something called a selection bias. Most likely what we saw were 40 people who were doing well. We don't know how everybody else on the Deanna Protocol did. So that's subtle. Now this one is really subtle. This one would be hard for almost anybody to pick out. So there are several different alternative therapies that we've looked at over the years, most popular being GM604, also one that we looked at recently called Oxilion, who show you a graph from an individual patient and say, look how this patient was progressing before, and look how they're progressing now on our treatment. So you see that graph over there on the right-hand side? That's an individual patient. That's their ALS FRS scores over time. And you can see for about the first 400 days, they were slowly progressing. And then all of a sudden, they leveled out. And by the end, they started to improve. So wouldn't it be attractive if the person had started one of these treatments at day 400? It would be kind of hard to ignore that that might be something that changed in them, right? In fact, if you said yes, you would be one of the majority of people who were very impressed with this anecdotal data and actually stood out in front of the FDA and demanded that they approve this drug, GM604, based on data like this. And in fact, this is not unique to ALS. There's papers published out there that talk about things happening in other fields. One of the most amazing to me is what's happening in the field of autism. You ever heard the rumor that vaccines might cause autism? So there are reams of well-designed studies that show that that's not true. But all it takes is one tearful mother on TV talking about her kid who got autism a year after he got vaccinated for something, and she's totally convinced that there's a link, and all of a sudden we start to wonder, right? So the reason why this is flawed is because the natural history of people with ALS is also variable within individuals, not just between individuals, but within individuals in response to alternative therapies. The article that I have up on that slide is from the New England Journal. It's like the fourth example of someone with a terrible disease who went to an offshore stem cell clinic and bought stem cells and came back home and developed a tumor somewhere in their central nervous system that wound up being comprised of someone else's cells. In other words, they paid tens of thousands of dollars to be injected with cancer cells. That's the kind of thing that can happen when you go off the grid where there's no oversight.